Hello? Does this thing work? This is the Peak Boredom Podcast.
Three, two, one.
Okay.
Welcome to the Peak Boredom Podcast.
Hello, good to be here.
Today we have Tania. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
I'm Tanya. I'm a designer.
And Tania's here to talk about accessibility today because she works within the realm of accessibility. So, do you mind telling us a bit about what exactly it is that you do? Because I'm not sure I can explain it properly.
Yeah, I'm working as an interaction designer and learning more about like service design. And accessibility is a big part of it because it's basically like making products and services in a way that like enables people, like whether it's just like any user, to perceive and understand it and like so it's easy to navigate and interact with. And yeah, there are different types of accessibilities. Like you can go into like web accessibilities, like for more technological things, but there's also like accessibility of like physical objects, and there are like different conversations around both that happen.
That's very interesting. So, what precisely does it apply to exactly? Like the stuff that you do? Is it more on website designs? Is it more on posters or signs? Or what exactly is it?
Currently, because of COVID, I am doing more digital, and so things related to like digital accessibility. So, like if I'm designing, let's say, like a form for something, making sure that the visual elements are accessible to people, and that could look like not using like reds or blues or not making it super colorful because people with color blindness won't really be able to, use it that well. And then also like making sure that the font that you're using is good. Like if you're using it to like put on a digital platform, don't use like, I don't know, chalk duster font or something like that, and like vary your font because there's so many ways to like show visual difference apart from like color, and size and layout is a big part of that.
I guess since we're going online, like for all of us, what would you define as accessible? Like just in your own opinion,
um
even just for yourself.
I think easy to use. Like I don't want to have a technology or like a platform that I spend hours learning and I hate using. So, like for me, Zoom was pretty easy to use. It's like, okay, like I just click the link and it takes me to the meeting, and then I can like talk to people, I can chat with people. There's so many people. I can access it on my phone, but also on my laptop. Pretty accessible. But even something like Zoom has its downsides because what about people that are nonverbal? Like it's not really accessible in that regard because if you can't, like for example, talk or like see, it's gonna be harder because Zoom relies on audio and video, and like yeah, you can like chat, but it's still not the same, right? And if there's somebody that's nonverbal with low literacy, then there's like a communication gap that happens. So that's one way to look at accessibility.
That's super interesting. But when you're doing the design that goes into this, do you go through like a mental checklist of the things that you should do and what you shouldn't do? Or like, for example, you mentioned avoiding reds and blues, was it? For colorblind people, not changing fonts, making things more accessible for people with lower literacy and stuff like that. Do you go through like this whole mental checklist or does it just come naturally to you, like when it comes to designing?
I had to learn. Like when I started out as a designer, I did not look out for these things at all. But it's like when you test them with people and then when you like interact with other designers, and it's like a learning process. So a lot of the things you pick up on, and it doesn't come naturally because you don't even think of it in that way. But like good design is being inclusive of everything without it seeming like it's inclusive of everything, sort of like you don't have to think twice about it. So when I'm designing things, oftentimes I like get a lot of feedback from people, and then I improve that with the feedback that I get. And then it's like things like something I wouldn't even have considered.
But does that make you notice things that are less accessible nowadays? Like, do you look at things that are not accessible and like it just irks you because you're so used to designing things to make it more accessible?
It actually
Yeah.
does. It does so much.
Like for me, it was the cinema. I was watching a video. There's this guy named Chella Man, and he was describing how like so he's like nonverbal. He needs like the what's it called, the caption thing.
Mm-hmm.
He was describing it's like how difficult it is for him even to get it. Like you need to go to the counter, and then the counter's like, wait, are you blind or are you like? Because they can't
Yeah.
know, right? And then like you get it, and then what happens if it's wrong? And then like in that scene, the caption was wrong. So there is like, I was like, the cinema isn't inaccessible for me. It's like no. I think that really irks me. Like when you see someone struggling and you've never thought about it.
Mm-hmm. I think another common example would be like if you go to like a traffic light and like the stop buttons to like walk across. For some of them, which really irks me, some of them you can just like they're like, oh, you just tap them a little bit and they like click. But the ones that have like just one button that you have to push, and if you don't push it, then it's not gonna work. I'd say that's not very accessible because it makes the person have to use like their hands, which isn't really inclusive of like people that can't reach it, or like also like during a pandemic when people don't really want to touch those services, so you can't use your elbow or anything like that because it's so specific.
Yeah, definitely with the pandemic, everyone has been more trying to be accessible, like having a button everywhere and be like, which is kind of funny. Like, why do you need a pandemic to remind you how inaccessible the world is?
Yeah.
I guess this comes to like, why do we need to make content more accessible? I think for me, the way I'm in planning, so it has to do with some kind of design. Although I'm not good at designing, but I think one of the things my process, which made me interested in design, was like that the world is not created for anyone but an able-bodied person. And as someone who doesn't look like they have any disability, I was like, I've never thought of that.
A lot of the things are designed for able-bodied people, like in terms of like speech and applications, and it's like and able-bodied, and also it's very like Western centered, I'd say, like especially living in North America. So there it doesn't leave room for a lot of other like diversity to be present. It's not very inclusive, I'd say. So I think accessibility, like inclusion, is a big part of it.
Yeah, I even heard like, those like those like water, when you go to the bathroom and there's a sink and then it's like you just have to put your hand like this.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Like
apparently.
those touch sensors.
Yeah, I heard that those skins are for like white people, like really white people. So they can't really, it's not really for other skins. So sometimes if like another person of color like puts their hand, it takes them longer because they don't sense it.
Oh, that makes sense. Like I always struggle with those.
Right? Me too. Like, are you racist? And then my prof is like, yes, I am racist. And I'm like, what?
See, that's
Oh.
really interesting because I read up on like accessibility articles and stuff. A lot of things are like specifically designed for like Caucasians and Caucasian skin in mind. Like even when like you listen to like diagnoses of like skin conditions or stuff like that, they're like look for redness or blotchy skin. But if you have like brown skin or black skin, you're not going to see the same symptoms, and that's like inaccessibility because it's only looking at like the world or like that specific thing from like one lens when there are so many different ones.
That's definitely interesting because one of the things I'm interested in to looking into is probably the medicine and how that is only in a way represented from the Caucasian perspective, and even psychology, right? From what I've heard, psychology only represents the Caucasian male perspective, which is why it's harder for girls to get diagnosed with autism because they express symptoms differently. Or to make it more physical, heart conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Like a heart attack doesn't exactly appear the same way in men than it does in women. For men, they got that tightness in their chest. I think they say they can feel pain in their arm. But for women, I think a heart attack is more like lower back pain, nausea, and some people say it's more similar to symptoms of vertigo or menopause, so they don't get diagnosed as easily. In terms of people of color, you're right. The symptoms that they say, like, oh, look for red blotchiness or like certain ways that it's expressed on the skin is not accessible because it does not really represent like how it's expressed in people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's interesting that you brought it up because I didn't think that that was an accessibility issue. I just thought that was a diversity issue.
I think so. Like when I was younger, my dad thought I had autism. I don't, but like because it was in the past where they said like autism was just for boys and like autism people are like, very like non-verbal and girls tend to be verbal. They're like this can't be it. But then I just imagine like kids who like have these symptoms that are girls and can't access those accessibility just because science says no right now.
Yeah, that's so difficult. But then also, I guess an interesting question would be, is like, what role do we have to play in making things more accessible? Because I know some people argue that almost, so for example, I don't know if I can use this example. Some might suggest that if you don't have, let's say, depression, then you can't really design things for people with depression. And I wonder if you feel like that's the same for disabilities. Like, do you think we as able-bodied people have that responsibility to kind of advocate for like people with disabilities, or is it the role of people with disabilities to do so?
I think it's sort of like it goes like it's a combination of both efforts, like able-bodied people and disabled people working together, because that's the best way to achieve things. Because if you are in like a position of privilege, then you should use that to help people that aren't, and like make the world so that it's more accessible. And I'd say that as a designer or like anybody that's designing products or services, it's really important to include people in those conversations and have them for feedback and stuff. So if you're designing more accessible products or services specifically for people with disabilities, then you can't just go out on your own and be like, oh, I think that this is the most accessible way to do it. No, like you need to have conversations with people with disabilities that are directly affected by it or that are, that rely on that thing, and then getting feedback and making them test that and really looking and incorporating their feedback and their ideas into the design. I think that's like, it's sort of like working together. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
yeah, so it's a collaboration at the end of the day, right? But how do you approach people like this? So when you're trying to design for people with disabilities, how do you approach them? Because I know like some people are more sensitive to the language that you use when you're approaching these kind of situations. So how do you do it?
We're like all immigrants, sort of. We were foreign in the country, right? How would we approach people who needs accessibility to a new country? Because that's also a huge issue.
Or like I can talk from my experience, for example. I was given the choice. So my mom really wanted me to learn Mandarin because she just wanted me to. And she gave me two choices. She said, either you go to Shanghai or you go to Taipei. And my first instinct was to answer Taipei because I love the food there. I've never been there, so I really wanted to go. I've heard so many things about the food there, so I thought I really want to go. But when I arrived there, I realized that it was really friendly to foreigners because the signs were not all in Mandarin. They had English signs as well, which was not my experience when I went to China previously. So when I went to China previously, all the signs were in Mandarin, in characters, not even like the Roman version of it. So my mom had to basically take charge of the entire trip and I could not go anywhere. She was of the mindset that if I was in that environment, in a sink or swim environment, I would eventually learn. But in my mind, I'm like, you'll just force me to shut myself in because I
Mhm.
can't communicate with these people. And I'm so scared of communicating with them if I have no way out. But in Taipei, they have signs in English. The metro system had a lot of English signs as well, so it was easy for foreigners to navigate. And I guess that's really helpful as well. So that's my experience with like accessibility in a foreign country.
Mhm. I think that's a really interesting topic because with a lot of like people that come to another country, like, and I'm gonna use Canada as an example, like apart from let's say Vancouver or Toronto, if they go anywhere else, there's not really a lot that they can do. Like if you go to Vancouver, yeah, there's signs. There's like Mandarin, and there's like if you go to like Surrey, you'll see Punjabi. North Vancouver has like Persian, and I'm sure like Toronto has similar things. Like if you go to like Brampton or Mississauga, but places like I don't know, like Alberta, Saskatchewan, while they are becoming more diverse and stuff, there is still that, and I would call it an accessibility gap because it's like a flaw in the sort of like design system. And so when people come to Canada with like limited English capabilities and they don't really know the culture as well, and it's the mentality like, oh, like, no, you learn to fit in.
Yeah.
But it's like, if you're not giving them the resources and the tools and you're not making the path easy for them to learn it, then they're not going to be inclined to learn it because it's presenting a lot of challenges. And that's why you see like a lot of people closed off, and then you have like these close clustered immigrant communities of like people from the same country or like ethnic group just scattered, and like, and that's why you're like, oh, this is like this town or this town, and it's like known for those like immigrant minorities. And it's like because that's, you can communicate with them, and like if you're in a foreign country, you need someone to communicate with, right? And if the people that you're going to be living with aren't going to communicate with you because they only speak one language and they're not open to like helping you learn, or they're not like very supportive of you in your learning journey, then you're more inclined to like stick with people that already know your language, that you can communicate with because it's easier, right? And we see this a lot with children of immigrants because it's like they're stuck in like this limbo where like their parents can communicate with them, and then they often are the bridge between their parents and then the other like Western society, and they like have to like bridge that gap. And I'd say that's an accessibility issue, like because it's systems that are in place that make it inaccessible for certain groups of people, and that's without intersectionality into play, because now we're looking just at like language, but add in other factors like if it's a person of color who's an immigrant with a disability, that's going to be an even bigger barrier to face, right? Like I've worked, or through like roles that I've worked at, I know people that are people of color who are children of immigrants and they have disabilities, and it's not only the like there's also like a language barrier there, but also on top of that there's like they're nonverbal and they don't communicate the same way, they have different communication methods, so it becomes really like tricky to have make for them to like feel included in spaces, because spaces are designed for like able-bodied, heteronormative, generally Caucasian people. Yeah, I don't know, that was a big tangent, but
No, I think that's
I'd like to
really
point
right.
out though. I'd like to point
Mhm.
out that this doesn't only happen in Western countries. This
Mhm.
like the English speaking example actually happens in Singapore as well. So Singapore is known to be pretty diverse because it's got multiple large ethnic groups. So like they've got a really, like, I'm not gonna mention it anyway. But the point is, one day I was in Changi Airport waiting for the immigration line. And while waiting, I don't know if you've ever been to Changi Airport, but it's pretty wide and spacious. So sound kind of
The best
bounces.
airport,
It's a luxury. That place is like a
honestly.
anyway, When I was waiting up for the immigration line, I heard one of the immigration officers in the corner saying to a guy, "You don't speak English? How are you gonna get a job here?" But it was kind of ironic because she was speaking to him in English. I just sat there wondering.
Oh, man.
Oh goodness.
And this was in Singapore, and Singapore is known to be pretty friendly to pretty much any population. Like my grandma does not speak English, but she speaks Mandarin, and easily she could get through Singapore without speaking a lick of English. But then this guy, who's an Indian immigrant, somehow gets stopped at the immigration border saying like, "You can't speak English. How are you gonna work here?"
Yeah,
That was interesting experience.
it goes back to intersectionality, right? Which people don't talk about. Like, if you're discriminated while you're a person of color, there's so much other like intersection and like that we don't talk about. Like, we treat accessibility itself as like one thing only, which is not true. I mean, like when my parents and I moved for Germany for a while because my dad was taking another degree, my mom actually had like German lessons. Like, we weren't there as a immigrant, but we were there as like a temporary resident, I would say. And she was taught like German, like just the basics. And my mom could go around easily, even though it's like mostly pointing and like bargaining and but that really helped my mom, because other than my dad at that time, it was just my dad who speaks like the most fluent German, even though he's like the most Asian guy you can ever meet. But that really helped, and it made me think like, if those things are not in place, my mom would probably be just stuck at home for like 2 years. Or like me, like, because like I don't, well, kids take languages, but even then I was a child of, of an Asian kid full of white people. And it was definitely, I felt really weird in a way that when I asked for accessibility, it's just asking more stuff than I need. And I feel that the same way even now. Of a lot of my friends who ask for accessibility, if it's like those like accessibility for learning disability, or when they get injured, it just takes them way longer. Like, they have to be like, "Oh yeah, we need it," and they're like, "Oh, you might not have it," and then they're like, "Are you kidding me? Like, I live with this." And then like it takes them longer, and it's different for each people. And I just wonder, like, why are we in a world where we just don't make that easy? Like, if one person finds this inaccessible, how are they gonna share what's useful to you?
Yeah, definitely. I can't say that I can relate though.
You brought up a really interesting point with the like, like friends, and like especially like if you're like, you were a POC in like a predominantly like German school, and like asking for those supports is like hard. And
Yeah.
I
It's
think
weird too, right? Because if you're an immigrant, they're like, "Oh yeah, you're here because you're the best of the best," which is not always true. Like,
exactly,
sometimes it's an opportunity that came in. Sometimes you're just not brave enough to say what you have, because once you have a disability, they're like,
There's no
"Oh."
turning.
Yeah, they're like, "You're so bad," which is not true. Again, I think an important point I was talking to Inga was like, why do people of learning disability or any disability have to be their own advocate, when like it's actually our job to be their advocate too, right?
Yeah, definitely. That's interesting. But actually, you know what? I have a question I've been meaning to ask, maybe because I don't study social sciences. What is intersectionality? Why are you guys quiet?
okay.
It's really hard, but the idea is, when you're discriminated, it's not just because you're Black, for example. It's also because of your social economic status. There's like other factors that comes into it that people don't talk about, because a lot of the time in the past, if you talk about racism, for example, it's because of you're a person of color. But then that's not always true, because it's also because probably you're a person of color who lives in a predominantly like underfunded neighborhood, and then there's also other things that come into play, like where your parents are and stuff like that, which is like undertoned, um, because we talk about racism as like this one thing. I don't know, what did you learn? That's like the geography term, I guess.
Oh, I think another good way to like explain it is sort of like if you look at like third wave feminism, because feminism started out as a movement for just white women and it wasn't really inclusive of other women of color, and then you have women of different like races, and they need feminism in different ways, like it applies to them in different ways. Like if you're a black woman, it's like you are marginalized on the fact that you are black and a woman, and that's going to be different than if you were a Hispanic woman, because the issues you face as a woman as a Hispanic person are different versus if you were like yeah, so it just like that. And then also the intersectionality between disability and like race, like you mentioned, is if like for example the model minority myth, like oh like Asians are supposed to be smart and like this and that and all of that, like overachievers and they're good at math and like they were, I don't know, that type of stuff. But then that makes it sort of like shameful for them to have a disability, especially if it's like a learning disability, because it sort of like goes against the stereotype, which is also very problematic.
Yeah. So in terms of creating content then, how would you make or design content to be more accessible? Like are there certain colors, certain patterns, certain fonts?
Or maybe like certain ways you would include. I think, yeah, like example in planning, my prof always talks about prototyping. So the idea that there's no end is just that you keep improving things you have, because if you end, that means you're not including like future problems. Like for example, a word, right? A word does not always have the same context in the future and the past. So you have to adapt.
I like that example.
Thanks. I'm not good at examples.
I think for like if you're designing, the one thing is to really know the people that you're designing for. Is like if you know nothing about the target audience and the users that are going to be interacting with it, it's like, then why are you designing?
Yeah, why? I'm asking questions.
Yeah. So you need to ask a lot of questions, and there needs to be like a lot of prototyping and testing. Like first you need to like brainstorm ideas, and then you need to sort of like use user personas and then test it out and make sure. But if we're talking about specifically like designing like content like graphics or stuff like that, then it'd be the same thing as like if you're designing for, let's say, children, you'd want it to be, you're not going to have like 12 point Times New Roman font, just one page of like hello. It's going to be like more colorful and like it's going to have more pictures, versus if you're like designing for like PhD students, it's going to be much different. I think one thing though is that you need to distinguish between like your headers and your titles and make sure that the layout is clean. Like yeah, things can be like, you can have a lot of visual elements, but make sure that they don't bleed into each other. So consistency is a big thing. It's like if you have a header, you want it to be like, you can be any font, and then the body, and then make sure that the context where they're being used is also being taken into account. Like if it's just going to be on the web for people to read, try using a sans serif font, and that would be something like Arial or Leto or like Roboto, because that's like easier to read. It's more consistent, it's more streamlined. Whereas if you're like printing for, I don't know, like a young adult fantasy novel, maybe you want to use something like Times New Roman, which is a serif font. So it has that more like traditional old look. Certain colors. I like to use, like, obviously if you're designing for like a specific organization or company that has a color palette, stick to that color palette. But if you're designing just out of the blue, like make sure that the colors you're choosing are like appropriate. And then because colors also convey certain meanings, right? Like if you're making I don't know, a poster for, like, let's say a peace and tranquility meeting this Saturday, you're not going to use like
Red.
red, or like you're not going to like use like blood splatters or stuff like that. You're going to use like softer pastel shades, so stuff like that.
Wouldn't it be funny though?
Yeah, I guess so.
I'm kidding.
Or like one of the things my professor mentioned was never put. He says the things that really irk him the most in some PhDs is they would put red font on blue background.
Ooh.
Why would they do that?
I'm thinking about that, and that makes me like, no, cringe.
I'm just thinking about those, those old websites where it's like weird like fonts everywhere, and then like the colors are off,
Yeah, don't do that.
and then you're like, wow, I'm coding.
Oh wow. So I'm guessing when you said like things that have to be, the font has to be consistent, that magazine fonts are out of the question. You know when people like to do those like cut out different words, different.
Mm-hmm.
Even the I am stealing you. Those like.
I think it depends
That
on
was
like
big,
the
right?
context. For like a poster, maybe like the max I would use that for is a header. Like if I'm creating like, oh, magazine book club, so then having like that magazine layout for like the heading would be fine, because that's sort of like a design choice that you're consciously making. But for the body, I would say no.
That'd be a nightmare. You
Mhm.
have to read.
Do you know why like people use that magazine thing?
Actually, no way.
It's because like if and I think I read this somewhere, where if you're like, I don't know, stealing or like holding someone ransom, you don't want them to recognize your handwriting,
Oh.
or them to get like fingerprints off of it, like because if your handwriting has been used somewhere else, they could like, track you down. So that's why you use like magazine cutouts, because there's more chance that you'll stay anonymous.
But don't you use your hands to stick it? I don't know.
And you could use gloves. I don't know.
I gotta use gloves. I just killed someone. Got it.
Wow. I'm actually interested in thinking about, or what are your thoughts on, I've been told while I was correcting my CV that apparently Times New Roman is an old font and no one uses that for CVs anymore. Is that true?
Is that true? I don't even know.
Okay,
I've been told to switch to Calibri, Verdana, any of those, but they say that Times New Roman is like old, but to me, Times New Roman doesn't really have style to begin with, so I don't know why they would look at it and say it's old, especially in an old country like the UK.
Burn.
Oh my. CVs are actually like the most, I would say they're a bit of a controversial topic in terms of design.
Is it?
Like CVs in general, yeah, because there is a difference between even like European CV design and then North American CV design. So like, I don't know if you put a picture on your CV or not,
No.
but I know, not in the UK, but I know that in like Eastern Europe or other European countries, like it's preferred for you to put a photo. But like in North America, or I'm guessing the UK, they don't want you to put your photo because because implicit bias is a thing.
Yeah, it can be racially profiled, right?
Yeah, and stuff like that. And some people are like,
Like,
it's
I have
okay.
I have a really white name, and then there's an Asian kid. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's up to you, but like it also depends on the jobs you're applying for. Like if you're applying to more, I guess, and the layout of your CV also really matters. Like if you're applying for more stuff in like the social sciences or like the humanities, I think Times New Roman is still used. But if you're applying for more like techie jobs where they're gonna really scrutinize like the layout and the design choices, they might be like, why did this person use Times New Roman?
Who
What if,
knows?
what if you just like Times? Like, why is it so controversial?
I don't know. I like Comic Sans, but apparently everybody has a problem with that.
I never really understood why everyone hates Comic Sans.
It just
I don't know either. Like, I remember one time, and this was when I first started in design, but I was just taking a graphic design class in high school. Oh my god, I did an entire assignment in Comic Sans.
I did too.
I've never personally favored Comic Sans. I just like Times New Roman because we used it in IB
Mm-hmm.
a lot. So I just got used to seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
And our 10th grade teacher was really adamant about all of us like using Times New Roman specifically. So that's why we used it. But actually, what are your thoughts on colorful CVs? You know, those really fancifully designed ones? Do you think like all designers need to have one of those? Or should you just stick to traditional?
I think the thing about colorful CVs that you have to look out for is if the employer or whoever's seeing it, like the print quality, because that would vary depending on the printer that you have,
Oh yeah.
right? Unless you personally print it out in color and hand it to them, chances are they're just gonna do it on a black and white computer. So if you're using color as like a really defining point of your CV, it's maybe not going to come through that well unless they're just doing it online. So I think the rule is usually just to keep your CV a solid color, and if you are using, like, it's fine to use a little bit of color. Like if you have some headers that are colored, like if you have like a, I don't know, like a dark green or like a dark blue, I think that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that.
I guess it goes back, like, you have to design it to be accessible too, right? Because
Mhm.
some people just view it for like 2 seconds. They're like,
Mhm.
oh no, no, no. Yeah.
That's what you're told, right? That people only view CVs for like 10 seconds and then move
Mhm.
on.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
people don't think that as like designing for accessibility, because they're like, it's a CV. Like, what do you want me to do? Like, make the font bigger? But like, it is sort of. It's just we don't talk about it like that.
Mhm.
I think going back, like,
Employer, right?
yeah,
Not the HR.
going back, like, what are common errors when we try to make things accessible that we don't think about? I think it's an interesting topic.
Yeah. Mistakes or maybe even accidentally being fake woke and going way too far.
Oh.
I think a
Um,
big thing in planning was like planning for able-bodied people. Like,
mhm.
if for millennial, they're like, we just need stairs, and then other people who need like accessible stuff are like, what the hell?
Yeah. I think definitely the one common error that people make is not including disabled people in the conversation and not taking them into account. Like I've seen so many buildings, and apparently like where if they're just 3 or 4 stories, they won't have an elevator at all. And I was like, okay, but what if, you're having a guest over that can't climb the stairs? They don't like like the elderly or like people that can't walk. Like, how are they gonna get up the stairs? And the response to that is just like, oh, we'll deal with it, or like get like a condo or a room like on the bottom floor. And that's not really the solution to that. It's like that's very, I don't
Temporary.
know, that's very ableist.
Yeah.
And I think I've seen that in the States more than in Canada, but it definitely does exist in like some places in Canada. But
Toronto.
that's a mistake. That's a mistake. It's like apparently like 5 stories, then you need to have an elevator. But under that, like if you have it to 4, then you don't need an elevator.
Like,
but I think that you should just have an elevator.
like, what if you break your leg? Like, you're
Yeah,
disabled for
exactly.
like, I don't know, maybe a month, but like that's not how it goes. But like, you're disabled for a few, I don't know, months. Like, are you just gonna have good friends that carry you all? I mean, that'd be cool.
Or even like moving stuff up and down, like furniture would be such a drag to move in and out of there. Like that's also really inaccessible, especially if you have like a big sofa that you need to take down. That's going to be really hard. Whereas if you had like an elevator, like, oh, you just need to like, yeah, it might be a bit tricky, but not as tricky as taking it down like 4 or 3 flights of stairs. No.
Like that scene from Friends, right?
Pivot!
Pivot. But yeah, definitely taking stuff like moving around a lot. When I was in undergrad, I moved accommodations every year,
Mhm.
so I know what it's like to like haul all your stuff
Yeah.
up and down, and it is tiring. I don't know why you have that limitation of just what was it, 3-4 stories have to have an
Mhm.
elevator, because in the UK that's not it. My building has 4 floors, and we have an elevator, and the staircase to the basement floor also has one of those machines that can carry wheelchairs, I think.
Oh, this
I've actually seen them work, but they do exist. Another one is during fire escapes. I've seen them before. I don't know if you've seen them. They kind of look like a mini trolley of sorts without wheels that you can push people down the stairs. I'm so curious how those things work.
That actually, I've never thought about that. Like when you have fire drills and elevators stop working and the doors close and everybody has to like walk down the stairs. What if like you live in a building as like somebody that cannot walk down the stairs? What are you gonna do? What if your only way of getting around is using the elevator? Are you just stuck in there while the fire drill happens? Because staying inside the building when there's a fire drill happening can cause you a fine. So that's also something.
What,
like,
really?
Isn't it? Or like,
Probably, yeah. I don't know.
or like you might get in some sort of trouble, I assume, if you get caught.
What if you died? You like, oh, I'm kidding.
If you die, then the fine doesn't matter now, does it?
Oh, it doesn't go to your family, right? Who? I think common error. What do you guys think of like making things more, green, but then like you forget about people's access, like the reason why it's like that. I think someone brought up. I don't know who brought this up, but like straws.
Oh, I did.
Is that you?
So I saw a video by Jessica Kelgren-Fozard who was talking about how in our journey to creating straws more accessible, we've actually, no, for more green, as in more environmentally friendly, we've somehow lost the accessibility of it, because metal straws are dangerous for people who can potentially have seizures.
Yeah.
Glass straws are dangerous for people who have unconscious biting habits when it comes to glass. What else was it? Paper straws are not very nice because they kind of
They're like-
dissolve.
They
Yeah.
just die. Yeah, I think that.
Fibrous ones, I think, like they can get splinters from. The point of, or like they say, what was it? A lot of the hard ones, they don't bend as easily. So for people who are bedridden, it's very difficult for them to drink out of a straw as well. And that's never really something that we've thought about, right? The fact that in our journey to becoming more green, we can sight of like the accessibility of it. So we don't actually, in her video, she says we don't actually have an accessible solution for straws yet.
Yeah.
And it might be because people don't think about accessibility, because no one's bothering to tackle it. They're just tackling what's the most green way that we can solve this, instead of how can we help people with disabilities to actually use greener alternatives to plastic straws.
Yeah, I think from that the common error is like you're assuming stuff.
Yeah.
Like when you design something for for that, there's a reason why it was designed like that, and just to delete that is like, unless it's a bad design, then like delete it. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that's definitely, I've heard that conversation and quite a bit actually when paper straws were being like introduced, and like now you have a lot of restaurants that only offer paper straws, and I personally like, they're very green, and yeah, go green, but then they're not accessible because like they fall apart the minute they hit like the drink, especially if you have something like a milkshake or anything, and it's harder to suck on too because it takes more force, like
So much work for a milkshake.
yeah, I know. And there is like, They don't
Yeah.
bend. Yeah. So it's like, how do you do that?
But like we're fine with it, right? But the question is like a lot of people are not a lot of people, but certain type of people are just not compatible with it.
Mm-mm.
And I
And
think that do you think that's a common error that's like often there?
I think it's a huge error. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, no.
it is a big error because it's like, how are they gonna get drinks? And then also, like, blaming people that can't use paper straws, like, oh, like, why don't you just use paper straws? It's not that hard. That isn't the right solution because I think designing paper straws in the first place, it was like done without looking at intersectionality.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they had done a little bit more research, maybe they would have, realized that there is like a very large population that's not comfortable using or that can't actually like physically use paper straws. Is there a solution? At the moment, I don't know. Like, there's like, I guess like biodegradable plastic, but I don't know if it can be made into straws. So those are definitely like questions that need to be asked and like things that need to be.
Oh yeah, I just wonder like we're talking about accessibility for people we can see that they're struggling, but I'm just wondering like what about people who we like cognitive disabilities or like learning disabilities where you don't necessarily like people hate admit those. They're like joke around, but like I know for you people like joke around, but then they're like, haha, I'm really struggling. I just wonder like how would someone advocate better for those things that like why aren't these like in our minds already? When it's like I think those are very common. Well, not maybe not cognitive disabilities, but I feel like for learning disabilities, oh no, both. Like it's very common to just because we don't see it. It's like
Okay, invisible
yeah.
disabilities.
How do we advocate for those people when we design for stuff, knowing that it's like you can't just assume someone is like is anyone normal? Like,
I'm already confused about how to like design for people with like severe dyslexia.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm like, does that just mean you use as little words as possible? Or do you change? Is it the font that maybe affects it? Is it maybe the color? At this point, I don't know. Because I've never seen like something that they claim to be dyslexia friendly design.
that's a yeah, because some disabilities don't really have like a solution, I would say. Like you just have it. I think a lot of my friends, and then they just tell them like, yeah, you just study harder, but how can we be more mindful of that?
With learning disabilities and a lot of people is like because they can't tell and they just think, oh, the kid is like misbehaving or whatever. So it's like often like it's a learning disability, but people are like, oh no, this kid just has behavioral issues or something. And I think unless we break that stigma that just because someone is acting out, it's not because they're like misbehaved or like they're like problematic. It's because they maybe don't understand. And it's like
Yeah.
I think it's like providing teachers and instructors with like that training so that they're sensitive to those issues and they can pick up on things. It's because like a kid isn't gonna know, and like
Yeah.
if you're attending school, you're not gonna know. But as an instructor or like somebody that's in the education department, if there are training programs or like resources that are geared towards it, then you'd be able to identify it early on and then create an atmosphere where it is accessible for people with learning disabilities to learn. And I remember like in my school, there was support staff for kids with learning disabilities, but I'd say that not to the level that it should be. Like it's a nice attempt, yeah, but then there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I think another thing is like, because us that are not in an education role, like people that are not like educators or instructors, I think we also have like a duty as to like one thing that I see is like a lot of people like if they joke about it, like shut down those jokes because it's nothing to joke about, right? It's like calling people out for, I don't know, making light of people with learning disabilities or like calling them like slurs or anything like that. Like making sure that as like peers and everything, we're making it a safe space for them to feel comfortable to like get the help they need. And then I think it'd be like an ongoing process.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So that's a really good note to end on, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tania, for being here.
Thank you
That was a great
for
conversation.
that was a great discussion. I'm really glad that you're working towards to make things more accessible. I hope you have fun.
Yeah. Thank you guys for having me. This is fun.
No worries. Can't wait for the next episode. Tune in. See you later. Bye.
Hello, hi. Thank you for listening to the Peak Boredom Podcast. This is Mars and Inga signing off, and don't forget to tune in next week. Please? Bye.